All right, I'm so excited to be here today. I'm so excited to be talking about the Black Youth in Science and Engineering initiatives. I've talked to a couple of our network members who are already working in this area, and it's been really fascinating to hear all the initiatives and all the independent work that everyone has done. I've had the pleasure of learning about Queen's Engineering Outreach's Black Youth in STEM program, the Blueprint and Engage program based out of Engineering Outreach University in Toronto, and Ontario Tech Engineering's Outreach Black Youth in STEM and Coding program. It's been fascinating really to hear about the different experiences in all these different worlds. I had a chance to speak to Gearing Up, University of British Columbia, and their partnership with Ethos Lab, Supernova, of which is particularly close to my heart because I went to Dalhousie University, and I talked to them about their various programming in different communities across Waterloo Engineering Outreach and their particular partnership with BrainSTEM Alliance, which I am super, super excited to talk about today because I have the founder of BrainSTEM Alliance here with us today. So DAndre Wilson, I'm so excited to introduce you to everyone and to get your insights. So welcome, DAndre.
Hello. Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. My name is DAndre. I'm really happy to be here today.
I'm really excited to have you here, DAndre. I want to hype you up, not a bit, I'm going to hype you a lot. So you're a professional engineer. What? Like a engineering, the ring thing. And you're also getting your PhD right now in data analytics and engineering education. And then on top of all of that work, you are also the founder of BrainSTEM Alliance. So I am so excited to have you here today. I know our network members must be ecstatic to have you here today. And just as a brief introduction, we're going to be having a fireside chat. It's going to be super chill because DAndre and I are cool like that. And I really want us to get into a genuine conversation about our experiences with Black youth in STEM. I started the STEM Girl trying to encourage more girls in engineering, and I realized there were bigger things than just girls in engineering. They're different youth that are underrepresented in STEM in general that we needed to reach. So, DAndre, about your own personal journey, I wanted to start with that because I find as we keep doing these things, as you get the funding and you run the events, you forget that you yourself, you're a case study, right? In Black youth in STEM, like you're literally the long goal, right? You're the end goal. You stayed in engineering, you became a professional engineer. So I just wanted to start off with where your passion for science came from in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess I am a case study. I guess I haven't thought of myself in that way, but I suppose so. For those who don't know, we're dialing in. So I mean, I'm living right now in Mississauga, which is on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. But I am actually born and raised in the Bahamas, which is the traditional land of the Lucayans, which are peoples, a part of the Taino peoples. So I was born and raised in the Bahamas for most of my life. Obviously I'm descended from Black people, African descendant, people who were settled into the Bahamas. But growing up there was definitely, I guess, maybe a different experience for some people who maybe grew up here. But my passion for science, I guess, I don't know. I guess I've always been curious. I guess children are mostly curious in general. Um, my parents always just encouraged us to continue to be curious. I do remember back in primary school, I had the opportunity to attend an international school for grades 1, 2, and 3, and they had what was called Eureka Club. And it was for students who I guess were high achieving and wanted to explore other things outside of the classroom. So we got to do like different math activities, science activities, and I remember enjoying that quite a bit. I wasn't able to stay at that international school. My parents just couldn't afford it after grade 3, and so we moved away from that. But they continue to encourage me and my siblings to try out any and everything that we were interested in. So we did a lot of things, did art, did sports. but I always enjoyed my science classes. So just being able to continue to do science in school um, was really good for me. Throughout high school, I ended up getting the opportunity to choose science. So, chemistry, physics, biology. Um, and yeah, just I don't know, it's something that I just from a very young age really enjoyed, and my parents just allowed us to continue to explore and experiment. I actually remember this one time as a kid, me and my siblings, we decided just to do an experiment just for the sake of it. We split into teams, like me, my siblings, my cousins. One team was who could make the worst stain. So we just took random stuff from the fridge, like ketchup, mustard, like anything that we knew could cause a stain. And then the other team was like, okay, they had to make the best stain remover. So we'd put them combined like dish soap and like laundry detergent, probably things we shouldn't have combined, but anyway. And so we took a t-shirt and stained it and then see who could get the stains out. My parents weren't too impressed afterwards, but they, weren't too hard on us, and they know we were able to experiment with things like that. We used to get outside a
That's
lot.
ingenious. Was that your idea, DeAndre, to try the
This
stains and
was
the
this was a
stain?
collective idea between me and my older sister and my cousins. We used to do a lot of things like that. So yeah, I think a big part of it was my parents just allowing me to encouraging me and my siblings
Yeah.
to try out a lot of different things.
Yep. And I think it's interesting actually that you said you went to an international school. I was born in Brampton, Ontario, but my mom moved us back to Nigeria when I was about 3, and I
Mhm.
started at an international school when I was about 7 in Ibadan, which is a very small town in Nigeria. But funny enough, they have a research facility, this huge research facility where they hire all these expats. And my mom taught in the international school, so I got the
Mhm.
privilege of going to the international school. And I think just the level of diversity they had at the school, simply because it was an international school, I think
Mhm.
it did affect how they taught us stuff and how they tried to engage everybody. I've never thought about it, but there were always clubs after school. And they were always, I remember being in games club, and science club was so much fun because there were so many art projects.
Mhm.
So I think it does matter, that kind of, now that I think about it, I had similar experiences where I had that exposure to very I guess an international set of people very young. So knowing that you like science, was your first idea, oh, I want to be an engineer, or did you even know what an engineer was, or how did you just get to that journey in particular?
I did not know what an engineer was at all. So, like I mentioned, once I got to high school, I knew I liked science, so I chose the science path. But engineering wasn't really something that I was exposed to at all. I met maybe one engineer for most of my childhood, kind of growing up. Um, so, I actually remember in grade 12. Um, I was taking calculus, and they had brought in a calculus teacher from Canada to the Bahamas to teach, and he was an engineer. And I was starting to think about what I wanted to do. And so as I was looking for opportunities after high school, I really enjoyed chemistry. I really enjoyed math and calculus and stuff like that. So I was like, what could I do that could maybe combine these things perhaps? And so ended up finding out about chemical engineering. And this was grade 12. I didn't know anything about it before then. So it just was sort of happenstance in final year of high school that I was like, okay, chemical engineering sounds like it could combine some of these things that I think I like. And yeah, so applied for chemical engineering, and that's what happened. Ended up studying chemical engineering for my undergrad.
Wow, that's such a, I think it's interesting how you just flowed right into it from school. I had a bit of a different experience. I have two brothers who are both engineers, and
Mhm.
it's actually funny. When I was very little, I did much better than them in school, and I'm talking like kindergarten, nothing that you can brag about or anything. But my parents did brag to everybody. Everybody that came, they're like, "Come here, let me tell you something." She's doing so much better than them in school. And I was like in grade 1, and they said it in front of me, and they told everybody. So when we got, and I think it's an interesting story because something that stays salient in all these conversations, especially on the path to engineering and STEM, is the level of confidence you have and resilience you have. And I know that I was maybe like, I couldn't have been more than 5 when they were telling these people stories, but I just know it stuck with me. Like just being 5 years old and hearing them say, honestly, these kids, these boys, they don't even know anything. As I got older, I'm like, honestly, they're right. You don't know anything. And then they became engineers, and my engineering journey was so like I didn't want to be in engineering. I want to be a teacher, and my parents were like, your brothers are engineers, and I'm like, you're right. Those guys think they're better than me. And that was mine. And I know it sounds really like, I just think it's interesting to hear the different perspectives or hows, because I know that might sound very competitive, but that's how it was for me. I was just like, if these two people think they can do it, and I beat them in kindergarten math, I can beat them in engineering. So no matter what obstacles I faced, that resilience, it was actually unnatural. And I think that's something that we find hard to explain, but engineering is almost it's sheer will, right? It's how many times can they keep like giving you a 46% and you keep going back and doing the exam. So that was what, for me, it's just interesting. That's what kept me going, was that little story that obviously made no sense because my brothers are obviously brilliant. But speaking of the obstacles, what were some instances that I'm asking you that you had where you had to like call up on that resilience, and what internal strength did you call up on, or was there a scenario that you remembered, or did you always call your mom, or what kept you going, I guess?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I agree. Like, that being able to ingrain that in yourself at a young age that you are capable, right? And I've already mentioned this, but and as you said yourself, my parents were a big part of that, right? Like ingraining that from when you are in grade school, in high school, being reminded that you are capable, even if you kind of maybe mess up on a few things. It's not and it's not a reflection on your identity or in your ability. It's just, a matter of circumstance. Maybe you could try harder, or maybe there was something else externally happening at that time that you didn't achieve to that level that you thought you could have. But it's not a reflection on you as an individual or as your capability, right? I think that was definitely something that I had as well growing up. Throughout high school and primary school, I was a strong performer in school throughout, all of elementary and high school. And, as I mentioned before, my parents encouraged us quite a bit to do a lot of other things outside of school. Like we did a lot of different sports and extracurriculars and things like that. So, learning to kind of juggle all of those things, even at a very young age, while still, doing well in school. And to that point that you said, even at high school, I wasn't valedictorian or salutatorian or, the top of my class. But I still had a confidence that, yeah, I'm really smart and I can do this. And, I didn't need to be the top of my class necessarily to know that I was capable. So, obviously that's something really good to have as you go into post-secondary as well. As you mentioned, the 46%, which, we can talk
Especially,
about
and
too.
you're never,
I
it's
agree
always
too much.
shocking.
Yeah. We can talk about that, like probably something I'll be exploring more with my PhD, because I'm not sure how much I agree with some of those 46% that, they give you in engineering undergraduate education. But definitely, when you get some of those, that can be a shock for sure, especially if you were a strong performer in a high school. But being able to have that, confidence to say, okay, this isn't necessarily a reflection on me and my abilities. This is just a reflection more so of the circumstances surrounding whatever led up to this grade. Maybe I could have studied more, or maybe I could have put more time in, or maybe I was, maybe I just had too many courses at this time, or whatever it is. maybe it was, a result of the instructor and the way that they taught. Like, there are lots of different other factors that doesn't necessarily reflect on you and your identity as a
Yes.
person. So, that's definitely something that I carried with me. Obviously, I think you know this. I think some of the biggest obstacles we faced, especially for myself coming from the Bahamas, moving to Canada for post secondary, is going from being in a lot of privileged to being not so much, and being the only Black woman in a room a lot of the times, right? Like, I think that's something that was also a shock as well. Just realizing, oh, wait, I'm going to be one of the very few that look like me when I'm here. And I actually did have comments from people that I went to school with at McGill, saying, like, they'd be surprised when I said I was studying engineering. Like, what? You don't look like an engineer. I'm like, what is that? What does that mean? What does that even mean? Like, like, I literally got that a lot. And it's actually funny. I got that both from like people of other racial and ethnic backgrounds, but also from other Black people, like other Black people in university. When I would hang out with them in some of our Black organizations, they would be like, "Oh, wait, what? You're studying engineering? Oh, I don't know. I thought you were studying." Like, there were a lot of people at McGill, like a lot of people, like Black people at McGill studying like international development, things like that. So they're like, "Oh, I don't know. I thought you were in arts or something." I'm like, "No, I'm in engineering. I've always been like first in and out." But so, those sorts of comments are also things that were, I guess, I don't want to say an obstacle, but a bit of a barrier to kind of, pushing through, right? And so, again, I think that confidence to say, actually, even if people maybe if I'm not quite what you thought, I know I can still do this.
Yeah.
And I know that I'm good at math, I'm good at science, so why wouldn't I be an engineer, right? Like, so those are, I think that was a big part of it. Obviously, finding a community was one big part of it too. I did join the National Society of Black Engineers when I was at McGill, and that
Oh,
was, a big part of overcoming some of those barriers too, like finding other people that were also Black and engineers and maybe experiencing some of those similar struggles that I were
yeah.
struggling with. So that really was a big factor in my undergraduate experience as well.
And would you say those experiences were why you kind of started BrainSTEM Alliance, or what needs particularly, I guess, personal needs did you notice within that undergrad experience that made you say, okay, I need to start something, and it's important that that it's specific and it's has a niche and there's an audience that I'm talking to.
Yeah. So definitely, being a part of the National Society of Black Engineers kind of spurred a lot of that and leading towards starting BrainSTEM Alliance. When I was a part of NESB at McGill, trying to continue to form and build that community for other Black engineers was a big part of it. And trying to build a pipeline for the next generation of Black engineers was a big part of it as well. So at McGill, I was able to do outreach with some of the communities in Montreal. Particularly, we would do outreach in a Black community called Little Burgundy
Right.
in Montreal, and working directly with the community organizations there. So we worked with Tyndale Community Center, actually, and realizing the impact that we could have by working very closely with community was one of the kind of ideas that led towards BrainSTEM Alliance.
Right.
So that was, I think, a big part of that. But BrainSTEM Alliance, I guess, the founding of BrainSTEM Alliance was a little while after, I guess, undergrad, and was a part of some of my other experiences after I got into the workplace as well.
Right.
So, I after I left McGill, I did my master's at the University of Toronto, got to do some amazing work there with, the NESB chapter at U of T, as well as with the engineering outreach office that you mentioned already. Amazing people there, doing work like the Engage program. So I was able to be a part of some of that as well. And then after I left U of T, I went to work in Northern Alberta in the oil sands as an engineer out there. And so that was another very different experience. So living and working in Fort McMurray, very, very, very small city.
Yeah.
But when I was working out there, obviously, in addition to being, one of the few Black women engineers on the site, but in general, noticing that there were a lot of engineers coming to Fort McMurray from all over Canada and all over the world, from lots of different backgrounds, and seeing community organizations in Fort McMurray wanting to make a difference, but not necessarily having the capacity to do so. Kind of the need. There were two needs that I saw. These engineers from marginalized backgrounds like myself, other women of color or women in engineering in general, underrepresented in the oil sands. A lot of engineers that were immigrants. There were a lot of them there, and a lot of them had somewhat similar stories to myself, like, really wanting to make a difference and create that pipeline for other engineers. But there weren't a lot of opportunities in sort of small city Fort McMurray for them to give back. And at the same time, realizing that there were a few community organizations in Fort McMurray that wanted to do more but didn't have the capacity. So BrainSTEM Alliance was kind of formed to solve both of those problems, to give these engineers an opportunity to give back while also building capacity in community organizations. So BrainSTEM Alliance was founded kind of as this network of STEM professionals who we call ambassadors, who want to help build capacity in community organizations. So it was about solving sort of two of those sort of gaps that I saw and bringing those together.
Wow. And I think it's amazing how it's all come together. And I think that's how we met even. I have a friend, Somto, who asked me to volunteer for one of your events, and she's one of your ambassadors. And I think it's really cool how it's all come together and how it's all worked out. I know for me, and this is a very different need that I noticed, I appreciate very much my background. I love the fact that I'm born in Canada, but lived in Nigeria. So I felt like I had a couple different perspectives. And I noticed that in all my classes, many of the Black women that were in my classes were immigrants or foreigners, but they were rarely from Canada, which I found very, very interesting. And it bugged me because I am from Nigeria, and Nigerians are they're very big on education, especially for they have like the three main ones are engineers, lawyers, and doctors, and that's their that's their main. And this is not a general stereotype. Engineers, Nigerians, people from Nigeria in general, they are very educated, and they do a lot in the education sphere. So being Nigerian, I did meet a lot of Nigerian women and a lot of Cameroonian women in engineering, but as a Canadian as well, as someone that was born in the middle of Brampton, Ontario, and went to high school with a lot of Black girls that I thought were amazing, I didn't understand why there weren't many Canadian Black women in STEM. And I found it strange, and it made no sense to me logically, because I thought to myself, if women from a different country are, why is it that if you're from a different country, it's that much easier to be in an engineering program? And yet if you're a Canadian and if you're a Black youth from Canada, I rarely see them in my classes. And that was what I noticed. And that's what prompted me to start the STEM Girl and trying to understand what was happening really with Canadian Black youth. So I think speaking of like those kind of challenges, and especially for Canadian, like Black youth in Canada, how do you think certain perceptions, do you think it starts from school or starts from teachers, do you think really affects perhaps Canadian Black youth in a way that makes them diverge from STEM? Or are there any perceptions or biases that you've noticed in your work?
Yeah, and I mean, as you said, I'm an immigrant, right? So I have a different experience than someone like yourself who might have spent a lot of their youth growing up in Canada. But, as I mentioned, when I came to Canada, it was a shock. And I think if you speak to a lot of immigrants, I think, it's a shock to them when they come here, from places like Nigeria or different countries in the Caribbean, across Africa, to realize that they are now the minority. right? Growing up in the Bahamas, like I said, lots of privilege for the most part. I mean, my parents weren't rich, but we were middle class. I'm light skinned, so I got that light skin privilege.
Yes, yes. And it's a real thing.
Yeah, that's a real thing. And my parents were both accountants, so they were professionals, and were able to give me opportunities as much as they could when I was home, and so I had a lot of privilege in the Bahamas, and then so coming here and realize, oh wait, I'm not in the privileged group necessarily anymore. I mean, I still have a good bit of privilege. That I'm still, I guess, middle class, but from a race and ethnicity perspective, realizing that now I'm the minority, it's a shock. And so, I would say for Canadian youth who have to grow up with that from when they are very young, realizing that they are the minority. I mean, I see it now with my own kids, right? Like I have 3 children. I have 2 boys, and a 3-year-old girl. And yeah, for my son who's in grade 3, I think there's only 2 black kids, him and one other black kid in his class.
Yes.
For my son who's in grade 1, I think he's the only black kid in his class. Like, so, realize like that's something that's ingrained in
earlier.
you.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
earlier, right?
Yes.
And so exactly what you were talking about before, that confidence that you had built from a young age, you may not have that same level, right? So you need
Oh,
to
whoa. I've never thought about it like that, DeAndre, because you're totally right.
yes.
From Nigeria, I had a fairly privileged life. My mom worked at an international school. She got paid in US dollars. We got to travel all the time. So from that perspective, whoa, my confidence was unnaturally high, actually. And and then it makes total sense, because when I got here, you're right. You do realize you're a minority, and you do realize you're perhaps different. But that confidence, it's very hard to remove it when it comes from when you're very young, like from a very young age. And yeah, it all has to do with, I was totally privileged at home. Wow, that is, my mind just exploded. So yeah, you're totally right. I've never thought about the fact that perhaps that kids here wouldn't have that very strong sense of self. And I think it matters, that sense of, I wanted to bring, and this is a question I have for you anyways, that sense of culture, because I know you're from the Bahamas, and I know your partner is Nigerian, so Nigerians have very, very strong cultural background, and I'm sure they do too in the Bahamas, and they have their own, their weddings are very different, and their food is very different, and everybody is so proud of it. Nigerians, to me, I've never met a more proud people. When they go out, they have their headdresses. It's so high. It's so, like, every time they go out, it looks like going to the Met Gala. And I've never thought about how that ingrained culture has made a difference. And do you think that for Canadian, perhaps Black youth, that cultural difference, or perhaps that, I'm not sure what I would call it, do they have a limit? Do they have, they don't have access to culture? Or how do you think that actually affects perhaps their joining in STEM programming?
Yeah, I think that affects confidence, right? Which, to your point, will affect their confidence to take on, a program in STEM where they will be even more of a minority than they already are, right? But to your point too, yes, my partner is Nigerian. Nigerians are at next level in their like confidence and pride. Yeah, but
It is. Oh, it's like, it's really. It's okay. I thought it was only me. I didn't want to stereotype my own people, but I'm like, sometimes I'm like, you guys are like, you okay.
they're next
Super
level. But
confidence.
it's actually kind of interesting, because I was just exploring this in one of my PhD classes. I was taking an EDI course, but these different levels of sort of connections to culture and self. Because yes, I can. I'm privileged in that I can tie back to my Bahamian culture, and it is a rich culture. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm descendant of Africans who were forcibly settled in the Bahamas, right? So my history of culture only goes back that much, and it was actually kind of interesting marrying a Nigerian and now having, kids who are half Nigerian. And my husband was obviously insistent on giving them Igbo names. He's a proud Igbo Nigerian man. And it was so important to him for these names to have meaning in the Igbo language. And it was something that hit me to realize that as someone who was a descendant of someone of Africans who were forcibly settled, I have no connection back to my original language, whatever that may have been. And so that feeling of, wait, I don't even know a part of myself, is something that can be a shock to your confidence. And even though I still have a rich culture of, the Bahamian culture to tie back to, there's still something missing. So how much more for Black children who grew up in Canada without even that, I have that connection to the Bahamas that I can draw on, but for Black children who grew up in Canada with even less of a connection to, a cultural heritage, I think that can take a toll, and does take a toll. And I think, obviously, in addition to that, as we mentioned before, kind of being a minority, and we can talk about all of the history of racism and everything that has led to it, led to now the unconscious and systemic biases that are in place. I think all of that does take a toll on Black youth, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that is a factor when we look at Black youth in STEM that we need to think about. And so, trying to strengthen the cultural ties that they do have, I think is a big part of it. But I think also what we need to think about, I guess, more broadly as Canadians, is making sure that Black Canadians can have a strong sense of identity as a Canadian as well, because that's what they do have, right? So they should be able to have a strong sense of identity of being Black, but having a strong sense of identity of being Canadian. And so we have to think about, as Canadians, what does it mean to be Canadian, and making sure that all Canadians feel included in that Canadian identity so that they can build that confidence as well in themselves.
Yes. Wow. This is such a good conversation.
We're getting deep.
Yeah, we got deeper than I thought. This is stuff that I I've never thought about. I'm just like, whoa, come to think of it. What a weird, and it's very, very, I mean, now that I think about it, it's, when you're going through life, especially as a young Black girl, you kind of just go through the motions. I know for me personally, my mom, and I think it really has to do with their experiences and their generation's experiences. I remember when stuff would happen. This is my mom's literal model for life. No matter what, she'd like, worse stuff has happened to better people. And that's literally, as a Black girl in Canada, I remember little things like, this used to happen a lot. Now that I'm older, it doesn't happen at all. And I think it's because of how I hold myself. But I think when I was younger and I'd have my afro out, random people would touch my hair in like the store, and they'd always be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I just couldn't help it. And even as a young person, I would just be there like, I don't know what to do right now. So I would just stand there, and not even now, I know my personality, I would just be like, it's fine, just go ahead. And it's been interesting, and I really do appreciate this experience, DeAndre, and it's not until you talked about just having that rich background from where we're from. I think that's the only thing that helped me be able to get past those experiences and see them as positive. I mean, truly, I can take all these experiences and externalize them as extremely positive. I remember being younger and having the people's hands in my hair, and I can see how now that I'm older, it's extremely intrusive, and you shouldn't do that. When I was younger, this is literally what would go through my head. I'd be like, I know, super cool.
My hair's the best,
right?
Yeah.
I'm like, I know it bounces. Go ahead, guys. So, I mean, it's just kind of interesting to have that different experience where, to me, everything I was just like, I know, I'm cool, let it go. Where for a kid that perhaps might not have that cultural experience, or that honestly rich, for me, Nigerian, it's a very rich Nigerian pride that I have. I think it would be that is a very intrusive experience, and it's traumatic actually, now that I think about it. And it's it begs the question of how we see each other, because I remember thinking in my head, and this is just true honesty, I remember thinking I could never do this to you. Like I could, that idea is wild to me. Like to go to a little like blonde girl and like be like, I'm so sorry, it's just so blonde.
No,
And this is
yeah.
just a straight up conversation for anyone that's listening. It would never occur. And this is something that happened to me multiple times in my life. And
Yeah.
I had friends who were white that I would tell, and sometimes they wouldn't believe me. And this one time it happened in the store with them, and they got so mad. And I'm like, I remember thinking, I guess you can get upset at this. I'm like, guys, you gotta relax. This happens all the time.
All the
So
time, right?
yeah, it happens all the
I've been
time.
freaked out every time this happened. Like I would get nowhere, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So that's I think it's a really awesome. This is I think for anyone who's listening, it's just something to think on, and just reflect on our own experiences. I see some people in the chat have had friends and family members that had similar experiences. So I wanted to get to that. I guess it has to do with similar experiences and similar connections. One thing that I've noticed of BrainSTEM Alliance is their absolute your share like conscious effort to really create content that is led by Black mentors and instructors, and it's done in such a way that it's graceful. And I love to see the different diversity, and it's not just one type of person from one place. And I also love to really see, and this is something that I noticed, I don't usually see a lot of Black men in a lot of these initiatives, in a lot of these talks. And I've noticed BrainSTEM Alliance really goes out of their way to do that. And I wanted to know, and I think this is something that I got from a lot of the network members, is how can we get those connections? How can we utilize those connections? How can we bring ourselves together? Because I think this is something we all struggle with. It's very, you can't just broadcast, oh, I only want Black people in science, because in reality, you're looking for diversity of thought, right? So
Mhm.
how have you been able to utilize those connections and really bring those Black instructors and mentors together?
Yeah, I think, kind of like this conversation we're having today, it's been been mostly through networking. And I really think making sure that you do tie into community is a big part of it, right? Because um, when you find some people who are passionate about this, a lot of times they will find other people who are passionate about it. And if you create a space for people to collaborate together, I think that's where you can have a lot of impact. But of course, I mentioned Nesby. Being able to be a part of that community was a big part of it. And a lot of like the Black mentors that I've been able to tap into, kind of started with the connections that I was able to form through Nesby. But I think also just being involved with a lot of different Black serving organizations as well has been able to, expand that network and find some of these other individuals who are passionate about this space. Working with Black Engineers Canada, which was recently formed. There's the Canadian Black Scientists Network as well. So there are these different organizations that are passionate about this work and do want to give back. And it does have to be a collaboration though, because so for example, we just did a summer camp with University of Waterloo, the STEM powered summer camp. And being able to tap into these mentors through the Canadian Black Scientists Network was great, but also having the team at the University of Waterloo provide sort of that backbone of administrative support was really important as well, because asking these Black mentors and Black STEM professionals to take on the entire burden of this, you're going to see burnout. And so, as much as these individuals do want to give back, asking them to take on the huge load of all of the program design, program administration, et cetera, can lead to disengagement. So we do need to make sure that there is support from allies to be able to take some of the burden off. But of course, there's a huge importance in making sure that we have representation in who we bring into the classroom when we're promoting STEM to these Black youth, right? Because as we've said before, that representation is so important. Being able to see Black people from lots of different diverse backgrounds doing lots of different things in STEM will make a difference for, these young people who may not have been exposed to these different ideas before.
Yeah. And I really like your emphasis on local communities and that trust between, like, creating those partnerships between network members and local communities. And I wanted to, let's get real here, DeAndre. Okay. So in the world, I feel like there's a lot of not just strife during the pandemic. I find, especially with things that go on with the US, there can be animosity between different minorities and different races. And I find, straight up, it's hard to get that trust between parents and Black youth, and getting them to trust that their black kids are literally safe in a certain space, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you generate that trust? Is it really just by having those Black mentors in the forefront, or how do you think network members and community partners, and even us as just founders of programs like this, how can we create more of that trust as partnerships, and as, because we're all in the same community, we all have the same goal. And I really, to me, that's something that I personally have found difficult. Like, it's only now that I'm doing more things, and it's been about 6 years since I've been doing this, and I can say that I'm actually getting into like spaces where Black kids are, and parents
Mm-hmm.
are trusting me with like having their kids in like a library. So how do you think we can create more of that trust, or do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, to be honest, you have to work with community. You like the wonderful thing that I love about what I get to do through BrainSTEM Alliance is that I get to work with these grassroots organizations, and so there's a lot of different Black-led grassroots organizations in communities wanting to do work in their communities, but they don't have the resources that they need to do all of the programs that they want to do. I mentioned one of my first experiences was at Nesby McGill working with Tyndale Community Center in Little Burgundy. This is a Black community in Montreal. So working with that community center, who already has the trust of the community, is so important, and making sure, and again, we could talk, I don't want to get too much into systemic bias, but but a lot of these grassroots organizations do not necessarily get the funding that they need to deliver the programs that they want to do in community to the level and extent that they want to, right? But these are individuals who usually were born and raised in those communities and understand the community and have the trust of the parents in the community. This is where those youth will come after school to like play video games and play basketball and like hang out and like whatever. Like these are the partnerships that we want to make, and these are the organizations that we want to support. We want to be able to make sure that we provide them with the support that they need, because they are going to be the ones that impact the community. They're going to be the ones that are staying there with those youth year over year, right? So working closely with those community organizations is a big part of it. And then, so obviously the other part of that is getting trust from those community organizations. They have the trust of the community. You need trust of the community organizations. And so, obviously a big part of that too is having individuals that are part of those same communities. Like I can go to a Black grassroots organization because I'm Black. Like I straight up, right?
Yeah, so, and that's just the truth. Yeah.
It's just the truth. It's just the truth. Like, so, making sure that, if you are, a high school or a post-secondary institution, and you are going to want to start some of these initiatives, you need to have a representative that aligns with that community in your organization, so that they can go and speak with those community organizations. And as I said, it's still important to have allies in your team that can support with building out those programs, but making sure that you have someone that can relate to the culture in some way is really important. And so you can make those connections. And then going into community where these youth are, I think is a big part of it too. So, yeah.
And I think I think that's, and you brought us in perfectly to the idea of partnerships. I know you've worked with Imatep at DAL a little, and I know you've worked with you've heard of Engage at UFT. I know for me, my first ever experience with like Black youth in STEM programs was with Imatep at DAL, and they
Mhm.
were running this program in the middle of it's called Truro, Nova Scotia. It's one of where Dalhousie's campuses is. It's the agricultural campus, so you can imagine it's
Okay.
like it's farm country.
Yeah.
There are like not that many Black instructors. And I remember I was like the only like Black person they could find at that time to actually run the program. And
Mhm.
again, the person that had been running it before me was an immigrant, and we were running it that for kids who were actually from Nova Scotia, and a lot of them
Yeah.
were mixed, so they were half Black, half white, and
Okay.
there was a lot of that uh, you could tell the relief from the community that they had a Black instructor, because a
Mhm.
lot of the kids don't necessarily always feel welcome, and in a space where everybody that looks like nobody really looks like you, especially in such a small town, it was very hard to get them to really come in. And I would literally have to go after school, stand outside the school and be like, hey, I have a program, it's going to be
Yep.
fun, there will be free food. And
Yeah.
and it's that relatability like of working with those small. And if I the instructor for Imatep, or the founder, Professor Cyrus, or Dr. Cyrus, he is from is he from Trinidad and Tobago, or is he from, I can't remember, but he's from an
Mhm.
island as well. And I remember we had that camaraderie because my mom is from St. Lucia. And it's that
Mhm.
connection that you have to people that builds that trust. And truly, it can only come if you literally have that connection, and then you can
Yeah.
bridge it between organizations. So I know you've done a lot of work with different community partners, but one of our network members, and you've worked with Waterloo Engineering Outreach, and it's been
Yes.
a phenomenal initiative. So I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about that initiative and why you think it worked, and why you think some other initiatives work so well.
Yeah, I mean, specifically with what we did at the University of Waterloo, so that came about because BrainSTEM Alliance was already working with the Canadian Caribbean Association of Waterloo Region. And so we were already doing some STEM programming with them, in the community. And so that we had done some STEM programs with CCAWR for Black History Month last year. And one of the speakers that we had for the Black History Month, and a professor at the University of Waterloo who was heavily involved with CCAWR, Dr. Trevor Charles, was like, "Oh, we should do more of this at the University of Waterloo, right?" And so he was able to kind of make the connection with Leanne at Engineering Outreach, so that we could start discussing what something that we could do. And so really it was again working with community with CCAWR. But as I mentioned before, the administrative support that the University of Waterloo was able to give to get this program off the ground, to um, set up the STEM kits and make sure that they were delivered to community. Having University of Waterloo students being there to provide any sort of technical support and support and lead some of those activities. So this was, a lot of really great work that the University of Waterloo outreach office was able to provide for the program. And so really for the Black STEM professionals that I was able to bring in from my network, it wasn't a heavy lift on their part. They were able to show up, tell their story, talk about their STEM disciplines, and we were able to get lots of Black professionals from lots of different STEM disciplines. From aerospace engineering to like marine biology, and all sorts of different aspects. We had like astrophysicists. So, they just were able to come in and like talk about what they're really passionate about and not necessarily have to worry about all of this background admin stuff because the University of Waterloo was able to do all of that. So I think
Yes.
really that collaboration, between the institution and community and the Black STEM professionals like coming together,
Right.
I
Right.
think that was what really made that program a success. And we're hoping that we can do that again.
And honestly, you're so right. I've never thought about it, but it's that in between admin stuff that makes it really difficult. I know for me, for the STEM Girl, my initiatives and my events, it's so difficult for me to run anything if I have to like handle like even just the Eventbrite. I'm like, we can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm like, create a link and do the event. And I know that's part of some of the work that I've done with BrainSTEM Alliance, which is how we met. I remember even just that one event where we had the moon phases with the Oreo cookie, just the fact that I had one little part in a whole big session makes it so easy to show up, right? And if it's your thing, you're just like, sure, I'll show up and talk about the thing that I want to talk about all the time.
Yeah, that I love and I do all the time, right?
And I know you've given us a few, like some good initiatives, but I'll mention some of the ones that DAndre did give us as example. So Rise in STEM, Elevate Youth Toronto, the Black Girls Collective in Vancouver, Rehoboth Alliance, Roots in STEM, BYTES Network, Black Boys Code, and Tech Spark. And these are just a few that are good initiatives that have worked and continue to work. I think even personally, this conversation has me thinking a lot about what I can do personally with my own initiatives and with running the national programs, what we can do to make sure that we're making genuine connections that are reaching the communities that need to be reached, and making sure that, and this is something that I heard from all the network members that I talked to, is we really need that sense of relatability. Like the kids need to see you, they need to relate, and they can be like, okay, I can actually be you. Because without that, it's very difficult for them. There's a genuine disconnect. And I'll end this, and right after this, we can have questions. This is personal, and this is as an author. When I was younger, I don't know if anybody's ever seen this movie. It's called Karina, and it has Whoopi Goldberg and Ray Liotta. It's a very old movie. And in it, she's trying to be an author. And that's the only movie in my whole life that I've ever seen of a Black woman wanting to be an author. And the whole movie, she only gets rejection letters till the end. Like she never gets accepted till the end. And it's a romance movie and it's a racial romance novel movie because they fall in love. But till the very end, she never actually gets this book deal. And I know when I was becoming an author, even just starting to write the kids' books, it was so salient in my head. I was just like, because I love that movie. Like I love the romance. I think maybe that's why I fell in love with romance novels. Like I was just like, oh, I'm like, she wasn't an author, but they fell in love. But so even in my journey, I think the whole time I was like, even if my books don't work out, I'll get romance one day. So I think, and this is just a bit of my personality, but I think for me, that one portrayal of an author was all I had. And it was so hard for me to start writing because I couldn't think. In my head, I was just like, so does that just mean, and this is just insight into what it does internally and the kind of things that you have to go through, you have to kind of mentally go over. I had literally in my head, I was like, so does that mean Black people just can't write? Because I don't know, right? Like this is a learned experience. I'm like, perhaps we're just not, maybe just singing is our thing and we just can't write. And then I thought about it and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. I'm like, then we wouldn't be good at anything, right? If I thought that way. And so I had to really, and last part before I get to the questions, I had one teacher, and then I think this is where kindness comes in for all races. And I think this is where I'll leave it at is, I think everybody forgets that every little thing you do, every little effort you make, even the funding, showing up, creating a space, regardless of your color, as long as you're being kind and you're making that welcoming space, it matters and you're remembered. Because I had a white teacher who told me that I was just phenomenal at dialogue. And to her, it probably wasn't that big a deal. All she said was, Jen, like she said, you're a natural at dialogue. And I was like, white people are really good at writing. I know that. And this white lady just told me, I was good at dialogue. And I know that might not be a comfortable conversation for everybody, but I think if we don't really hear these things, these internal conversations people are having to have with themselves, you won't really understand how to bring it all together. But that's a genuine thing you kind of have to go through. You have to go through this hurdle where you're not sure if you're like you said, in engineering, you see yourself, you're the only Black lady, you're like, maybe Black ladies don't know how to engineer. And then one day you're like, that doesn't make any sense, and you kind of have to do that in your own head. Imposter syndrome, exactly, in all the spaces of imposter syndrome. So I went 2 minutes over, but now we have time for questions, and I leave it open for questions in the chat room. We have 12 minutes or 13 minutes. DAndre, virtual high five. Woo!
Woo! Oh. I mean,
I
yeah,
saw
I think,
some.
as people, I don't know if anyone's put anything in the chat, but, as you were saying that, that idea of representation, I touched on it before, but it's so important, especially as we mentioned for youth and Black youth. And, when we think about it, it's not just for the youth to see, right? It's for the teachers to see, it's for the parents to see. And I think, especially here in Canada, that's something that we need to try and emphasize a bit more as well, where Black people are the minority, making sure that, to your point, you only saw one movie about a Black author. That's sort of this idea of the single story. That single story is all you knew, but making sure that Black youth can see multiple stories for themselves and multiple opportunities that they can explore, and multiple opportunities in STEM. Like not every Black youth might want to be an engineer. Maybe they want to be a physicist, right? Or maybe they might be interested in medicine or something else, right? So just, again, I think that's an important part of it too. And I think that's also important for, as I mentioned, for the teachers to see, and for the parents to see. And because if, as a teacher, all you've seen is Black youth going into trades, let's say, like, that's going to be what's in your mind is maybe the best path for them. But if you can see that there are Black, professionals in a lot of other disciplines, then you might be able to see that Black student in your class in a lot of other opportunities. And even still, like, I think this is also important for the parents. Like you spoke about your oh, so we have a bunch of questions. Okay, I'll just finish up this thought. But,
keep going.
You were saying how, your mom giving you confidence was a big part of it. But I think for a lot of Black youth that grow up in Canada, their parents, again, because of colonialism and systemic biases, they might have ended up not in STEM. They might have ended up, in social work or in some of these other, in the trades. And so even from the Black parents' perspective, they think that, subconsciously might think that their kids should follow that path too, because they haven't seen that many Black professionals in STEM in Canada. So I think this is all really important part of, representation and why it's important.
And I think this is part of this question. What advice would you give to a young Black student who fears that going into STEM, they may not find any opportunities after they finish school, as the percentage of fully working Black engineers is even less than Black students that enter undergrad? I have a brief answer, but at DAndre, I'll give you the space. I know for me in high school, I had, and it's not until now, I think Jennifer Flanagan mentioned this the other day, you don't really think about what adults are doing until you get older. I had a few BIPOC teachers who, and this is a real thing and it only happened with my BIPOC teachers, and it doesn't mean my white teachers weren't wonderful, but this was a specific conversations I had. I got sat down. They were like, Jen, you're doing math, you're doing science, you're like, want to be one of the few Black girls in STEM. They're like, you can't mess this up. You have to keep going. And this was a real conversation from like 5 different teachers isolated. I had a Sikh teacher, Mr. Walia, a Trinidadian teacher, a Chinese teacher, who all specifically sat me down and literally told me the opposite of that would happen. They were like, I know what it's going to look like. They were like, I know you think it's going to be impossible, but they're like, Jen, you need to stick to engineering. And that's the advice that actually it worked for me. Like them telling me that, no, it's the opposite of what you think, because of there's so few of you, you will always get a job. I literally was told that when I was like 15. They were like, Jen, you're Black, you're a girl, you're doing the STEM. They're like, there's no other options for you. You just got to do it. And that's a real thing that I was told. DAndre, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, the advice, I guess, I would give, I think, it's like you said, yeah, having that support and encouragement from your teachers is very important. But I think, yeah, it goes exactly to what I was saying before. A young Black student who thinks they might not get opportunities, there's lots of us actually out here getting opportunities. So to your exact point, Jennifer, if you persevere and if you continue to have that resilience, you can and will be successful. And there are Black people in STEM out here doing that. You know, I might not say this to the student, but I would say this to everyone here. Something that we do need to think about too, though, is again creating these spaces of inclusivity. Because as someone who has worked as an engineer, the reason why we might see less Black engineers potentially in the field is because those companies need to work on their inclusivity to retain Black engineers. But finding your community, finding someone that you can relate with, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in your undergraduate or master's, PhD, academia, wherever you end up as you're going through that STEM career, find someone else that can be your your kind of champion. Together, you guys can like walk this path together, and you will find those people. And if it was me talking to a student, I would say just come talk to me, because I'm happy to be that person for you. Or to connect you with someone else, because I think that's a big part of it. I had NSBE when I was in my undergrad, and so having that community was able to push me through. And then when I got into the workplace, I was able to find a few other Black engineers. Obviously, my husband is also a Black engineer, so having people that you can kind of walk that path together. And yeah, there's going to be some microaggressions probably along the way, but if you have that community with you that you can move through, you can still be successful, and you can still really enjoy your work and make an impact.
I agree. And I in one word, I would say, or if I put it in a sentence, I would say you simply cannot fail. And that's for kids of all colors, of everybody, of all genders, because it's something that young girls really need to hear as well. It's that idea of failure and that it won't work out. Don't forget about it. Like, forget about the failure. It's like a lie. So just keep going. There. Boom. So easy. No, I'm kidding. Okay. So next question. One of the areas you mentioned as important is having members of your team represent the communities you want to connect with and the youth you want to serve. Do you have any advice for how to promote opportunities for those positions and opportunities to potential instructors? DAndre, I think.
Yeah, I think what a lot of institutions, I think, well, organizations in general, need to rethink sort of the requirements that they're kind of putting in job postings and things like that. Because there's like, it depends obviously on the role specifically, but imagine if you were able to get someone who's already been working in community for 5-10 years now to work at your institution, and then they have a direct link back to community. They already know all of those people there. They already have built the trust. They may not have an engineering degree, but they can still make those connections and relate back. So I think that's something that you really need to think about, because a lot of those individuals can still learn what you need them to learn while on the job, but what you can't necessarily have a white person come in and learn is how to connect to the Black community. So those are things that I think that institutions really need to think about. I think,
and it's a difficult conversation to have, and it's one that I think can make people uncomfortable, because you basically have to be honest and say, but sometimes we don't relate the same way. It's in essence, right? Even, and I know DAndre, I've seen you post a few times about this. The way we speak sometimes between each other is different, and even just that connection in speech and just having that relatability, it makes a huge difference. And I think this is a great segue to this question, and it has to do with how can we better understand how we can navigate like colonial systems within institutions, and how to do that in a way that supports the work. And I think it's a great question, because a lot of like Don said, a lot of the institutions aren't actually aware that they're the depth of their colonial practices. So how can we circumvent that in a sense without being in your face, like, okay, do the Black stuff all the time?
There's so much. I mean, I'm doing my PhD right now, right? And there's a lot that needs to be done in this space. And so, when we think about these colonial ideas of how we even measure someone who's successful or not, within an institution is something that needs to be considered. Academic institutions also have a lot of sort of jargon that, again, when we talk about communication, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with how well someone might be able to do a certain job. And so when I think about, especially Black people, like going into academia, there's a lot that the academy needs to think about. And, you know, this decolonialization of the academy is something that I think Indigenous communities are really pushing towards as well. And I think, you know, as Indigenous communities are making headway, it's going to affect a lot of other marginalized groups like the Black community. But, you know, when we think about, again, the types of potential certifications people might need to have, or some of the hoops that, you know, even myself looking at now, you have to jump through to qualify as a PhD candidate. It's like, why do I need to cite a bunch of white people in my research when I can gain, like, a lot of the knowledge that I've gained is, you know, from my lived experience, from community, from you know, other people who are maybe doing things in different ways. So I can talk a lot about this, and we can go, like, this is gonna be like a
Yeah,
whole
we have,
conversation.
we have 2
But you
more
know,
minutes.
we just need to think about a lot of the practices that we have, and how they are colonial. And you know, again, you made the really good point, Jennifer. Like, the way that, you know, you and I can chat and be kind of chill would not be necessarily the way that we might behave, quote unquote, in a professional academic environment. But why is that? It's not that if we you know, behave in those ways, it doesn't mean that we're going to be less effective. We'll probably actually be more effective and more impactful in our work. But we've put these sort of unspoken rules about the culture of how we should be working in place that is not inclusive to people from a lot of different backgrounds. So we need to really think about, like, why are we doing it that way? Does it need to be done in that way? So, you know, it's not, I guess, a clear, concrete answer, but I think it's something that, you know, especially a lot of the directors in these, especially in the universities, but also in the school boards, et cetera, need to just think about, like, why are you doing it that way? Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really the question that we need to continue to ask.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, when I think about it, the biggest one that I can think of is speech and how we talk. It's very, very different. And I know in my past experiences, I've had to know, like, mentally be like, okay, Jen, now you have to talk, like, different. And I think it's interesting that I've
Code switch. It's time to
never,
code switch, people.
it's quite a switch. Even
Yeah.
even when I'm hanging out, it's like I have to switch quite quickly. And I've always, it only recently occurred to me that I'm always the one switching. I'm like, why nobody ever switches for me? And then if they did, it would be weird. Like, if somebody started talking like the way Black, I'd be like, that's weird now what you're doing.
Yeah, that's what
So it's just an interesting paradigm actually to live through. Honestly, I appreciate it all. And I still always leave with the same idea as be kind. I saw one last question, I'll answer it quickly, is, do I find so many of the kids have the incredible fear of failure? Quite frankly, with research and even in my experiences, it's actually quite gender-based. Like, young girls have a much stronger fear of failure than young boys do. And young girls are a lot more, they're risk resistant. As CEOs, women tend to not take as many risks. So I would say that I know in my research, I found that even among Black boys and Black youth, if they don't do well in school, they externalize. They say it's because, like, of racism and discrimination, and that's why I didn't do well. But if it's a young girl, she'll just assume she's really bad at it and just assume she's a failure. And that's across like colors and experiences. So we are only 1 minute out.
We're pretty close to finishing on time.
So close. We have the session evaluations at the top there. Please definitely give us your evaluation and tell us how awesome you thought DAndre and I were. Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm super excited. I hope you all learned as much as I did, because honestly, I came out of this, like, as we were talking to DAndre, I was like, oh, some deep stuff, honestly.
I was gonna say, like, we can go
Awesome.
real deep into some of this stuff. I'm like, yeah,
I
yeah.
know.
But
Yeah. But I
no,
think
thank you
it
so
was
much,
good.
Jen. It was a great
Yes.
conversation. Great seeing some of the comments in the chat. So thank you for having me. I'd
Yeah.
love to obviously continue the conversation with anyone who wants to have a conversation. But I really appreciate you making the space for me to be here with you today.